This has been a very interesting, just preparing a little bit for this has been a very interesting exercise for me because it does bring me back to when I started working. I just gotten out of the Army after college, and I went to the State Department. And I started working in what was called regional affairs, RA. And RA had Europe and Scandinavia. So the first thing I did was file some bunch of papers on Scandinavia. And then I met some people and moved off to work on what was then called the common market. So really the first substantive job I had in RA involved trying to get the UK to join the common market. Seemed like a really important thing, and one of the things that I noticed, and I'm going to try to talk today a little bit about the famous dog that didn't bark. The dog that doesn't bark in the articles that I'm seeing about the Brexit is the importance of the role that the United States played, not only in, as I began by mentioning, trying to get the UK to join the common market starting in about 1960, but the whole formation of these European organizations. I was just reading upstairs the little blurb on the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. There is barely notice of the fact that it grew out of the Organization for European Economic Cooperation, which was the organization that the Americans and the Canadians set up to funnel aid into Europe, Marshall Plan aid mostly into Europe in 1946-47, in that crucial period. And the thing says European statesmen wanted to do this. That's very nice, but from my perspective, there was an awful lot of American push behind this. And I'm not sure, maybe because, I was a little bit involved in it, I'm not sure that any of this would have happened had the United States not been intent on seeing the Europeans form these organizations which were supranational. We were always afraid. We envisioned a Europe where all these countries were involved in rivalries and might be picked off one after another by the Soviet Union. And it was a very big part of the office in which I was working, the effort not just to get the British in, but to strengthen these organizations. And there were all sorts of, there was the European Payments Union, there was the European Coal and Steel Community. These organizations were all organizations that the United States, from my experience, was trying to promote. And when we think of them as largely, they were, of course, European organizations, but we were very much behind them. And I think we provided, there were a lot of people in Europe and quite a few people in the United States who did not want to see these organizations develop. So the role that we played, especially I think the Department of State and the Defense Department, was very important. When I read about this now, there are a whole lot of things that don't fit for me. The story has always been that the Soviet Union collapsed in 1990. The whole weakening of the Soviet Union in the 1980s was because of the Reagan policies, the Defense Department, the missile, all the technology. In my view, what brought down the Soviet bloc, what broke it up, was the vision of the success of American policy, and I call it American policy, in Western Europe. You could see on television how people lived in Western Europe compared to how they lived in Eastern Europe. Eastern Europe wasn't terrible. They made real progress. But the comparison with the West was very painful. And I think people all over Eastern Europe were aware that Western Europe was much more successful. And I attribute that not to missile defense or, spending on the military, but largely to the success of the European organizations which we had supported. I think one question that's going to come from this audience is a question that nobody can answer. And the question is, how far will Brexit go? What is going to happen? Will it lead to a cascade of exits? Will it lead the Dutch to leave, the Italians to leave, the Spanish to leave, some of the Eastern European countries to leave? I don't know if anybody can I don't think anybody can answer that question. We don't know what's going to happen. But my view is that we have an enormous stake in this. We had, for 60 years, more than 60 years, because I only started in this area in 1960, for 75 years, a really successful and far-sighted policy. And I hope that this is not the beginning of the unraveling of that successful effort. I want to start with a few more details about the American role in the creation of what we then called the European Economic Community. Another name was the Six, because they were the Benelux countries, Italy, Germany, and France. The Six, and which grew into the 29-member European Union. I look around this audience, and there are a few people who may remember what I remember, but Europe was poor and in very bad shape at the end of World War II. General Clay, who was one of the administrators, or I think he was the head of the occupation in Germany, said that if the Europeans had to choose between the communists and 1,500 calories a day, or a hope for democracy and 1,000, they'd choose the communists every time. So we were talking about food, how much food the Europeans would have in the immediate post-war period. Go to Europe now, you can't imagine that people were thinking about food, but they were. And the level of poverty, if you look back, think about Italy and The Bicycle Thief, the movie The Bicycle Thief. Think about Italy again. Americans had a lot to do with the breakup of the sharecropping system, which had existed for 500 years. A friend of mine named Bob Brand was involved in that from the embassy. Bill Colby, who I worked with, Bill Colby is much better known for his role in Vietnam. But Bill Colby was the CIA person in Rome who was passing out money to the de Gasperi regime, which was the democratic regime. All of these countries, France had probably 25% communists, the Italians maybe had 30. Europe was in very bad shape at the end of the Second World War. And the Americans, I think the American view was that these countries had to get together. So when we gave Marshall Plan aid, we usually insisted that there be some effort at coordination. We didn't always succeed in getting the Europeans to coordinate, but we made a certain amount of progress. again, maybe one of the ways to understand what we started with. Many of you probably have heard of the Morgenthau Plan. Morgenthau wanted to turn Germany into basically a pastoral country. The general said, yeah, we can do that, but we'll have to find something to do with 25 million Germans. So this turned out to be, but that's not where it stopped. The French wanted to take the Saarland, the coal areas of Germany, just as they had tried to take them at the end of the First World War. So we were dealing with a political situation, a lot of poverty, and a lot of pressures to do the same kind of things that had worked so badly at the end of the First World War. In commercial terms, what I remember very well is I had a cousin who was in the trade area, and my cousin said, we don't want to have a European common market. Some of the European countries have low tariffs, and we can export to them, let's say the UK and the Dutch. And the others have high tariffs, the French and the Italians, and we really don't want to have a unified Europe, because what will happen, and indeed what did happen in many areas, is that when the Europeans formed a unified tariff regime for agriculture, there was the common agricultural policy, and there was a common external tariff around all of Europe. Some of those tariffs were higher than tariffs in countries like Holland and the UK. So we were facing certain domestic risks. Some of my friends here have heard the story about the chicken war. Have any of you know about the chicken war? Well, I'll tell you, we were selling 60-pound bags of chickens, backs and necks, it was called. People called it the backs and necks problem. We were selling 60-pound bags of backs and necks in Germany to make into sausage and soup. And the Europeans, the common market had sort of taken hold, and the Europeans were putting a common tariff on all chicken. And it was going to be, I think, something like 20 cents a pound, and these backs and necks were selling for 12 cents a pound. So it was a prohibitive tariff. And there was a lot of protests, especially from Arkansas, because Senator Fulbright, who was an important political figure at the time, represented Arkansas. And there was this backs and necks problem. And what were we going to do about this? So on a Friday afternoon in the summer of 1963, a telegram came from the State Department saying it's really urgent, everybody should go in and talk to the people who are going to the Common Market meeting in Brussels on Monday, and everybody should tell them our position on backs and necks. This is a Friday afternoon in the summer in Europe. People don't work late on Friday afternoons in Europe in the summer. Maybe they do now, but they sure didn't then. And so the telegram went out saying, talk to your counterpart about backs and necks. And a cable came back very quickly from Rome saying, we've talked to the minister about backs and necks, but he's much more interested in breasts and thighs. So there's a serious, there's something serious under this, and that is that there were a lot of interests, American interests and European interests, that were not in favor of a European common external tariff or a common agricultural policy. But politically, the Americans, and I think this is really important to remember, Americans pushed very hard for this. This was, in my view, I read these articles now that don't mention our view, our position at the time. But I think they really miss how important our role is or was in constructing this Europe. So there were other people who had, there were German, just to give you an idea, in the agricultural area, which I worked in a lot, there were banana interests. Now, we don't produce bananas, but our companies produce bananas in Central America. The French had a preferential system for bananas from Africa. Our people were our big companies were very concerned that that they were going to be shut out of the European banana market by African bananas because the French had these preferences. So there was pressure on us to pressure on the American government to oppose aspects of the common agricultural policy because of bananas. European grain, well, we think of the people in Europe largely, we think of France as being the country which has a sort of tradition of protectionism. But it was German grain prices that were the highest, and it was the Germans, we were afraid that the Germans would ally with the French and others and set a regime for imports of grain that would shut American grain producers out. So the point I'm trying to make here that I want to emphasize with you is that the American government took some real risks to support the unification of Europe. And there were key figures in this whose names have sort of been forgotten. There was a man named George Ball, who was the Undersecretary of State at the time, and a very powerful Undersecretary of State. People know him, as they know Bill Colby, for their association, Bill Colby from the CIA, for his association with Vietnam. George Ball was one of the most outspoken Americans against involvement in Vietnam in the 1960s. And if you do what I just did and look for him on Wikipedia, there'll be very little mention of his role in Europe, a lot of mention of his role in the Vietnam debate. The same is true of Bill Colby, who I mentioned before, had a big role in supporting the Italian government right after the war. Many of these people, like Bill and like Bill Colby and George Ball, these people had all served in the military. Bill Colby was in the OSS during the war, parachuted into Norway, that sort of thing. George Ball had been involved in the Lend-Lease effort. A lot of the people whose names I've recalled as I've been working on this, preparing this little talk, a lot of those people had been in the military and in the occupation of Germany at the end of the war. So they had deep and abiding interests in this area. There were reasons why the State Department was so interested, going back now to the Brexit issue. There were reasons why the U.S. wanted very badly to get the U.K. to join. The principal one was that the U.K. was a liberal trading country. There were, inside the six at the time, before the UK joined, France had a reputation for protectionism. There were aspects of the Italian regime, tariff regimes that were very protectionist. The only real liberal trader inside the common market, when there were just six, was Holland. And the Dutch were very interested in having the UK join. For other reasons, the Italians, who had a long relationship with the UK in the Mediterranean. The Italians were very interested in seeing the UK join. not the least because they were afraid of the Germans. A lot of the people inside the EC, or a lot, quite a few of them, had real reservations about having an EEC, a European Economic Community, dominated by the Germans. So there were, in addition to the things that were the negatives about the EEC for the U.S., there were positive reasons why we wanted to see the liberal forces inside the common market strengthened, and we thought the UK would do that. I brought along, just to sort of put in a plug for my book. I wrote a book about 10 years ago about competition, and it's relevant for this talk because the Americans were philosophically committed to a Europe where there was more competition. And we thought that they would do very poorly if they continued in the tradition, say, I've mentioned the French repeatedly, if they developed the kind of protectionist policies that were identified with the French. The French had what they called national champions, industries that they tried to develop within the country and support with the government. The Germans had a different regime, but also had essentially national champions. And we thought that the UK going in would increase the commitment to competition. Now, I brought in the book because it's about competition in the United States, but in 2005, right after I wrote it, I got a telephone call from Mario Monti. Mario Monti became the Prime Minister of Italy in 2007 or 8. Mario Monti had been the commissioner at the EU for competition. I had never met him. I knew who he was. I had never met him. He called me and he said he had read my book about the United States and competition in the United States, and he wanted to translate it into Italian, and because it was part of the ongoing Italian debate. I mean, the reason Europe has always had, or in my view, the reason Europe has always had quite a bit, or recently, until recently, quite a bit of inflation, is because they have these powerful interests that can raise prices. My argument in the book about the United States is that in the 70s and 80s, we broke up the people in the United States who were able to fix prices, and the reason we don't have much inflation anymore is not because the Federal Reserve Bank is so astute, but because we have so much competition that people can't raise prices. And that was not the case in the 60s and 70s. But we've always had much more competition than the Europeans have. So Monti wanted to translate my book and did translate it because he thought there was something for the Italians to learn from it. And it was used in the parliament to some avail, not a great deal, but it was, it was a flattering thing to get such a phone call. So I'm going to sort of come to a conclusion or move to the end and open this up to questions, but my feeling about Brexit is that it's a victory for those who, over the centuries, have sought to limit competition in Europe. The central idea in economics, as far as I'm concerned, is that one word, competition. I mean, that was what Adam Smith wrote about. He wasn't writing about GDP or anything like that. He was writing about the importance of competition, breaking up the government-supported monopolies. And competition is what we supported in Europe when we supported the development of the EC, when we supported the entry of the UK into the EC. We were saying we think you ought to have a Europe in which there is intense competition. And we took some risks to do that. Now, when we read about competition, we think about immigrants, the Chinese, people like that who are competing with us. But in my view, people who don't like competition don't want domestic competition either. And it's almost always the case, I think if you look at the history, that the people who don't like foreign competition are not crazy about domestic competition either. And it has its political ramifications as well. So the opponents of competition in the UK won this round. And I'm concerned that it may lead to a downward spiral. I'm not sure that there are going to be the checks and balances that there ought to be to maintain the kind of competitive Europe that we encouraged for 70 years, Steve. Thanks very much.
So we're going to have question and answer. I'm going to be first because I'm president. When we were promoting these organizations after the war, it was really a national security or global security issue. We really were concerned about the Soviets kind of grabbing, not necessarily moving in, but making friends with these European countries, and we were concerned about that. Do you think there's a national security or global security issue now connected with the risk that Brexit creates?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I don't know. You know, as we discussed a little bit earlier, Russia is not the Soviet Union. That is, it's got about half the population and maybe a third the birth rate. So there are a lot of reasons why I think the Russians are not as, and they don't have the ideology but I think there are a lot of possibilities of picking off countries. You know, the Serbs have, as we know from the First World War, always been part of the, you know, the Slavic. There are these aspects of Russian nationalism which have appeal elsewhere. And certainly the Russians have those who prefer state power can justify it by looking at the Russians. So I think there are real risks. There are real risks. I hope that they don't, anyway, I think there are real risks. Yes?
Another question from an AIER member. My name's Ted, I'm a data scientist here at AIER. If you look at Google's data the day after Brexit, the #1 search was, what is Brexit? A lot of people didn't even know. And that search is emanating out of England, or the UK. And what are the chances, in your view, that the UK actually doesn't leave the European Union after all?
You know, I don't think anybody, again, I started out by saying, I don't think anybody knows this now. These are these kinds of political unknowns that pop up, you know, one person. I mean, look, who thought that Boris Johnson, who led this thing, was going to sort of say, well, I'm out of it now and walk away, or the what's his name? Tell me his name. Well, no, the other guy, Farage. Who thought that Farage was going to say, okay, I've finished and walk away? I mean, I don't think we know how the politics of this is going to play out. I think the British would love, you know, a lot of people would love to just keep the good parts, but I don't think that's an opportunity that you get all the time, you know? I think there will be people inside Europe who you already have the Romanians saying we want to be able to get our people into the UK. I mean, there are going to be a lot of pushes and pulls. And, it took from the time I got involved with UK membership in 1961 until the British finally came in with 73, de Gaulle had, there was all sorts of pulling and tugging. And I think that's what's going to go on, and we don't know what's going to happen.
I read this week that already the British said they want to wait at least 2 years before they institute anything about leaving. So that was in the Times. So can you comment on that? Of course, that sort of goes with your question.
Well, I think a lot of people would like to have, but there are other people inside Europe who are saying, let's do it right away. We can't have this long period of uncertainty. I don't know which way that's going to come out, probably somewhere in the middle. There'll be, but one of the possibility is that you pull on one string and then you pull on another. It doesn't all happen at once. It happens in a long period. So you end up, hopefully it stops at some point and you maintain. I mean, I was never in favor of a political euro. I don't like the euro very much. I think the euro is very limiting. So, certain things I could see go, and you'd keep the essence of a common market, an open trading system, a certain amount of political cooperation. But whether it stops at some sensible place, I don't know. I just don't know, and I don't think anybody does. I read these articles, and it just seems, everybody, they're very present-oriented. There's no sense of a history here, which is always what I think is important. I mean, you just have to look at the history. Teach a course sometimes about the build-up to the First World War. I mean, you just have to see the similarities here. As Steve said in the beginning, you try to learn something from history. I read these articles, and I don't see very much of that.
Ann? Just before the Brexit vote, Obama happened to be in the UK for another meeting, and he made a strong case in a press conference for Britain to remain, for the Remain folks, for Britain to remain in the Union. Given the history that you took us through, are the reasons for the United States supporting the Remain, well, we know that's not happening, are they the same? Are they different? What is going to happen? Is there going to be, how would you describe the special relationship now between Britain and the United States, and the United States and the rest of Europe?
What I think is very similar is that our support for the UK coming in, we always sort of disguised that. I mean, part of the reasons the articles don't talk much about it is because we always pretended that this was the Europeans making this. So Obama saying, there's always been, it's not anti-Americanism. Anne and Don have lived in France for a long period of time. My view of the anti-Americanism is they like Americans. They really like America. And they know that or they think at least, that we have saved them on a number of occasions. But they don't want to have us too prominent. So one of the reasons the French didn't want the UK in is they thought the UK was a stalking horse for the Americans. So I think that kind of thing, we have to, but I think the same vociferous tendencies inside Europe that we were trying to contain in the this long period, I think those tendencies are pretty much still there. I don't, maybe you have other views, but I think those tendencies are still there. The Dutch are still much more likely to want a soft arrangement with the UK, an easy exit. than, say, the Germans. The Germans are talking to when I read what the Germans are saying, it sounds like the same thing they say to the Greeks. And I think the British and the Greeks are a lot different. I mean, the Greeks are small and weak. The British don't see themselves as another Greece. So anyway, I don't know if that responds to your.
Weren't there also a lot of non-economic factors that led to this proliferation of a lot of nonsensical regulation coming from Brussels, concern in the UK about undermining their long-established legal tradition with a super government undermining legal decisions made in the UK? Also immigration control, I think that was probably a big driving factor to get people to vote for the exit.
I think immigration was a very big factor, and I think some of these other factors, some of the ones that you mentioned, are, probably important. I'm not putting most of the stress on the economic. I put the stress on the political, and I think there are these nationalistic ideas are very powerful. And they always were. Look, the British barely went in. I mean, it was a big decision. In '73, when they finally signed the piece of paper, there was a big debate. And then in '75, it came up again. And, all of these things have, this Brexit thing is just the latest iteration of. And of course, it's like all the concerns in the United States about regulation from Washington. Jesus, most of the regulation is at the state and local level. I mean, the thing that hurts people, it's probably more regulation inside the UK than coming from Brussels that's bothering people. That's my experience is that people say, oh, yeah, Washington's making us do that. But it isn't Washington, it's Boston or, God knows Beckett, but that's sort of my feeling about probably, I don't know, but my guess is that that's what's going on in Europe. After all, it's the prime ministers, British, if they pass all these regulations, the governments have to agree to them. So, I don't think you can blame all this stuff on it's handy to be able to blame it on Brussels, but I'm not so sure that's where it's all coming from. Yes.
Speaking of hatchets that have been buried about an inch deep, what do you foresee as the impact on the relationships between Ireland and Britain if this Brexit really goes through and changes some of the banking relationships and things like that?
I wish I knew more I don't know much about the banking relationships. My suspicion is that I don't really have any views on that. If you excuse, I just don't know what's anything about that. Excuse me. Let's go back then and yes?
What do you think the chances are, if any, that the United States can have any meaningful input to this whole conversation about Brexit?
Well, I think Obama gave it his best shot. But I'm not sure that we will have very much influence. We still have a lot of influence, but I don't think, again, in preparing this, I began to think that we had much more influence back in the 60s. And if it had been very obvious, it would have been counterproductive. But I'm sure we're going to push as hard as we can for continuing the relatively open markets in Europe. We're still trying to negotiate a transatlantic partnership. I think maybe one of the big casualties of this will be the transatlantic partnership. I think that may be it was not looking very good before, but it's probably even worse shape now.
I was just going to say, one of the things historically that's the advocates in Europe for the Union, the EEC at the time, really was saying, gee, if we had more experience working together in these economic areas, we understand the value of that. We really didn't have much history of that before that. And so one of the positives, they've been at this now for 30-something years. Now they actually see the pluses and minuses of being more open to each other. You have a sense that even though some of these older trends are still sitting there, that this experience, they've learned something from this experience?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I think in the United States, the opening up of transportation, which happened right at the end of the Carter administration, trucking, what's called trucking deregulation, but it was really the end of price fixing in trucking. It's not deregulation. We didn't say, you can take your bumpers off and things like that. We said you couldn't fix prices anymore. And the Europeans, I think, have benefited greatly from the facilitation of transportation and the domestic market. I mean, there's still lots of efforts to protect, but they're much less than they used to be. So I think the Europeans all, or at least most of them, will try to preserve that. I think the euro has been a problem because the euro gives the Germans such advantages that I think it's reawakened a certain amount of protectionism in other parts of the EU. Again, I don't know too much about that either. Howard, yeah.
Some of what was written at the time, the beginning of all of this, also had a whole political part to it. They talked about the United States of Europe as a concept. And I can't judge the degree to which that's what American writers said, and there was no such thing. So the core of my question is, and I know they're intertwined, but how much of the decision in Europe to go ahead was political for countries that have been in war most of the time for 1,000 years versus economic?
See, I was always skeptical. See if I get around to answering your question. I was always skeptical about this idea of a United States of Europe. There are lots of jokes, even within, about Germany, thank God his father isn't a Berliner, those kinds of jokes that went around. So, Europe, the sense of nations is very, very strong, and I was always skeptical about whether they ought to go to the political side. I have friends who I greatly respect who always thought that was the political side. I think just getting along as countries, working together on trade issues, on investment issues, I thought that was pretty good. And if you just stopped there, you might have avoided some of these problems. I think the immigration problem, I don't know how far you can go toward a United States of Europe. I'm not sure how far we can go toward a United States of the United States right now.
I always find it validating if your view and mine coincide, because I always thought that it was a delusion on their part, because they had all the separate colonies. It wasn't like the 13 colonies, right, which had the roots were so much aligned. They were, as I said, they were at war with each other most of the time for 1,000 years. It was always inconceivable to me.
Yeah, it's very hard for me to it's very hard for me to see very much in the United. I don't know whether you have views on our European experts.
No, I just remember that. I don't remember, but I remember reading that in the early days of the European Union, the dream of a united Europe was very powerful, and it was used by the creators of the economic part as a goal or as a desirable outcome. Of course, this was close to the horror of World War II when that argument had lots of appeal, basically restraining Germany and avoiding a lot of the misunderstandings and terrible things that they've been doing to each other for half a century before. George Ball and William Colby started doing their good work. But over the years, I think that that appeal has faded, that the rise of a kind of nationalistic, supremacist, neo-fascist right in many parts of Europe, in fact, by now almost every part of Europe, has created a groundswell of support for just the opposite tendency. So that argument that it's time for us, an individual member country, to begin reasserting our own heritage and culture, to avoid getting swept up into this faceless, characterless European identity, has crowded out the old European dream.
Yeah, that's certainly, I mean, that's certainly my view. I mean, your mention of this word restraining Germany, I probably didn't put enough emphasis on that. I mean, this was one of the really important things that was, a lot of the countries in Europe were concerned about a Europe that would be dominated by this economic superpower, which is Germany. And I think what we're seeing now very much is a very powerful Germany inside Europe. And this is going to scare a lot of people. I don't know what the outcome of that fear is, but it scares people. There's a lot of history there. So, yes.
I hope this question isn't too big a meatball, but when they talk about economic entities and the three strongest, they always talk about the United States, China, and I guess it's the common market or it's the European market that you're referring to today. And how are those figures generated? Is it the European Bank? Is it the European common market? Who generates that of these group of nations? I mean, intuitively, there's nobody else it could be than those three, but how do they generate that?
Well, Europe has 400 and some odd million really quite prosperous people. I mean, it's really a very prosperous, my God, compared to when we used to hitchhike in trucks in around Italy or something. I mean, Europe is hugely prosperous, and that market, I mean, it's as big a market for Chinese products, I think, as the United States is. And China is just big and maybe not getting bigger, but generating the figures. I mean, they come from everywhere. They come from the IMF, they come from the International Monetary Fund, they come from the UN. You know, the figures, even if the figures are off by 10 or 20 or 30%, those are the biggies. Those are the biggies, right? So.
It's a far different world now, though, than it was in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and the impact of the internet, for example, which I think plays a large part in its transmission of information, probably 90% of which is incorrect. But what is your view on the impact of that, particularly with respect to the British elections?
Everybody talks about the impact of the social media, and I guess it's really a big thing. The people who are, I would think the people who are the least, the voters who are the most pro-exit, Brexit voters, probably the ones who are the least internet connected. I mean, it's, I guess my view, now that you make me think about it, is the elites it's always a fight for me between the elites. It's somebody in the elites decides he's going to mobilize the public, the less educated public. And maybe the internet gives you more access, more ability to do that. But, you know, I'm not sure. I was talking the other night with some people. There's a wonderful book about the First World War called The Sleepwalkers, which I've been thinking about again recently because, well, anyway, but in The Sleepwalkers, every country at the beginning of the First World War, every country had a huge popular press, and it was usually for war. You know, Russia had one, Serbia had one, Austro-Hungary had one, Germany had one, Britain had one, France had one, sometimes tied to politicians. But this was the way to get to the masses through these, you know, penny newspapers. Maybe there's some qualitative difference now. I'm not so sure. I just don't know if there's a qualitative difference.
Just kind of following up what he said, do you think it's like to some degree generational and like you're saying forgotten history, like you're saying the day of the vote coming out on the internet, it was what's Brexit? And because my understanding is that the way the vote fell was the majority of you know, more the elderly population, we want to call it that, and the younger generation wanted out.
Or the younger generation wanted in. They wanted to they were.
The older generation wanted out.
Older generation, yeah. Yeah, the older people wanted, you know, the Little England.
Okay.
Also, the people outside of London,
Yeah.
greater percentage wanted out.
So it wasn't then forgotten history or not even known history, because it was, I had it reversed, okay.
Well, but it often, you know, again, I think a sense of history is really important, and not very many people have it. So.
Can I say, as an Englishman who actually voted Remain?
Oh, good for you.
That's the way I thought it was.
I think Cameron thought that he would win, and for a very long time the Conservative Party had been divided between what you might call a sort of nationalistic group who resented interference from Europe and felt that we needed to keep our own policies, and the financial side from the City of London, who saw the importance of economic cooperation. So that was one side, and Cameron had been so troubled by dissent within his own party that in the end he called a referendum a very big mistake, and he thought he could win it. The other aspect, so there was half of the Tory party who wanted to leave, and Boris Johnson represented, and incidentally Boris Johnson had been a journalist in Brussels, and he was one of the sources of the false reports about straight bananas, if you know about that. He suggested that the European Union was requiring only straight bananas to be sold.
Oh, I need this story. I've been telling this chicken war one for so long. I need a straight banana story.
This was totally false, but Boris Johnson had done that 20 years ago. The other aspect was, yes, there was, certainly some of the older people were for, I mean, I'm old, but I was for very strongly for Remain, and most of the people that I knew were for Remain. But there are a lot of people in Britain who are unemployed, who worked in the coal and steel industries, which have totally collapsed. And I grew up in an area in South Yorkshire where steel and coal were the dominant industries, and where now the area is with a large amount of unemployment, a lot of immigrants coming in. Blair made a big mistake. When Romania and Bulgaria were admitted, the European Union had the right to say they can't come have free entry for 7 years. And most of the countries of Europe said that. Blair decided not to do that and to allow them in. Perhaps that was a generous policy. The result is that many have come in and they're taking jobs away from English people who probably don't want to do the kind of jobs that they're doing. So it's very complicated and disastrous, I think, for many of us who are British. And we just hope. Theresa May has said Brexit means Brexit, but who knows what Brexit means?
Well, that's my point. I'm not sure where this is. I don't think we're going to know for a long time where this is going. That's my feeling. I mean, all these other. When I was telling Steve before we started. On the 4th of July in 1964, I was lying in bed in Paris and expecting to go to the Kennedy round, what was called the Kennedy round of trade negotiations in Geneva. And I got a phone call saying, everybody who speaks French is going to go to Vietnam. You can resign. I didn't resign. I went to Vietnam. I took language training, went to Vietnam. 5 years later, I came back to Paris, and I was talking to this friend of mine. And nothing had changed. I mean, it was, it was like Rip Van Winkle. We were all talking about the same trade issues and I think these trade, I don't know when the Kennedy round was finished. I think it went 12 years or something like that. And I think this may well be one of those events that this kind of, there are all sorts of things that have to be negotiated. There are a lot of people who are going to be in the room. This could take a very long time. So I think we don't really know where it's going.
Paul, you think we might be driven into this clannishness because there's a failure of belief in conventional or traditional wisdoms? We've had a sort of point of view, the way the economy would operate, the way borders are controlled. And that's no longer working for us. You know, we see this disconnection in our economy between, productivity and job growth, income rising, and then we have this disconnect on the borders. No one knows what it means to release, the Middle Eastern chaos into the more or less better organized world. And because of that, people just simply, are afraid, so they want to go back and find some base that they can work off of. And one of the things in this country is we've had a great accumulation of wealth that seems to be sat upon and is waiting for that next technological breakthrough, that next sign, that will release the energies that will kind of make human progress sensible again. But it's not happening right now, and I think it's causing people a strong discomfort, and it's showing up in their reaction to national policies, economic and political.
Well, there's certainly a lot of strong discomfort. The question I ask is whether there's more strong discomfort. It seems to me that these kinds of changes, again, I teach this course on the period before the First World War. It was the period of the fading out of agriculture and the urbanization of all these countries. I mean, one of the things the Second World War did was complete urbanization in places like Russia, which were still rural. But in a lot of other places, the urbanization was what happened at the end of the Second World War. There have been really jarring changes in economies over a very long period of time. And I don't know that this one is particularly, maybe people say, oh, it's the social media thing. I'm not sure why people are more agitated now than they were when they had to move from the farm to the city. I don't know the answer. I don't know. I don't know how much these are economic, what you're saying, economic issues. I just don't know. Every now and then, I saw an article last night, I wish I remembered the author, who, anyway, is this some sort of men versus women kind of conflict? All of a sudden, it's a change in the role of men. you know, I don't know what this is all about. I have opinions, but that's all I have. Yes,
How
please.
surprised were you to the worldwide market reactions 1, 2, 3 days after the vote?
Well, you know, this seems like a big thing. And then everybody calmed down, but I look today and I see that the pound is as low as it was. You know, it's off, what, 15% since, and that was, the immediate reaction was that it went off 15%, and it's off 15%. People think it may go down. In the European or the UK real estate market is not so good, or worse than it was. And so I think I think the most immediate effects are obviously going to be in the UK. I'm not sure that they're going to be very big here or in other parts of the, you know, just don't know. That's why I want to get out of the stock market. All right, thank you.